On the morning of June 10th, 1912, Villisca, Iowa, should have woken up quietly. The town was small enough for routines to matter. Doors opened. Breakfast fires started. Neighbors noticed who was outside, who was late, who had already begun the day. But at the Moore house, there was only silence. No children stepped out into the yard. No voices came from the kitchen. No one answered when the neighbors became uneasy enough to check. At first, it was the kind of silence a town explains away. A family overslept. Someone was ill. A door had been left closed a little too long. Then the door was opened, and Villisca crossed into something it would never fully escape. Inside the house, 8 people were dead. Josiah Moore, his wife, Sarah, their 4 children, and 2 young sisters who had only come over to spend the night. They had gone to sleep after a church program. They had entered the house as guests, children, parents, neighbors, familiar faces in a town that believed it knew itself. By morning, the same house had become a crime scene so brutal, so strangely arranged, and so unresolved that more than a century later, people still return to it looking for something. Some come for history. Some come for ghosts. But the real question is darker than whether the Villisca house is haunted. The real question is why the truth never managed to leave that room. Most haunted houses begin with a legend. Villisca begins with a fact. 8 people were murdered in a small Iowa home in 1912, and the crime was never conclusively solved. That alone would be enough to keep the case alive. But Villisca did not remain only a murder file. Over time, it became something stranger, a preserved crime scene, a local wound, a public attraction, a ghost story, and one of the most infamous unsolved murders in American history. Many people approached the Villisca Axe murders by asking one question: who did it? That question matters. But it is not the only question this case leaves behind, because the deeper mystery is not just the identity of the killer. It is how a quiet family home became a place where evidence, rumor, religion, fear, failed investigation, and ghost lore all collapsed into the same story. To understand Villisca, we have to separate the crime from the legend without pretending the legend came from nowhere. We have to look at the town before the murders. We have to walk through the night. The house went silent. We have to examine the details that never fit neatly into one explanation. And we have to ask why, after more than a century, this case still feels less like a closed chapter and more like a room no one has managed to clear. Before Villisca became a haunted name, it was a town built on ordinary confidence. In 1912, Villisca was not the kind of place Americans imagined when they thought of danger. It was a small Iowa community shaped by churches, neighbors, rail lines, local businesses, family routines, and the quiet visibility of small-town life. People knew who owned which store. They knew who went to which church. They knew when children were expected home, when chores should begin, and when a house was too silent for too long. That sense of familiarity matters, because Villisca was not terrifying before the murders. It was terrifying because the murders happened inside a world that believed familiarity was protection. The Moore family fit naturally into that world. Josiah Moore was known in town as a businessman. His wife, Sarah, was active in community and church life. Their children were part of the ordinary rhythm of the town, the kind of children people saw at church programs, in the street, around family errands, inside the predictable map of a small community. On the evening of June 9th, 1912, the Moores attended a Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church. With them were 2 young sisters, Lena and Ina Stillinger, who had been invited to spend the night at the Moore home. There was nothing in that arrangement that should have sounded ominous. Children visiting after a church event was not a warning sign. A family walking home after an evening program was not a prelude to horror. A quiet house after bedtime was not evidence of danger. That is what makes the case so disturbing. The final ordinary hours of the Moore family were made of things that should have meant safety. Church, neighbors, children, a familiar street, a locked night, a home. But beneath that ordinary surface, Villisca also belonged to a different America. This was an era before modern forensic discipline, before sealed crime scenes became standard public expectation, before DNA, before surveillance cameras, before the instant reconstruction of movements through phones, cards, vehicles, and digital traces. A murder investigation depended on access, memory, testimony, observation, local authority, and the fragile condition of a scene that could be damaged almost as soon as it was discovered. And in a small town, curiosity could become part of the evidence before anyone understood the damage it was doing. There was also another shadow over early 20th century America. The country was connected by railroads, travelers, salesmen, laborers, drifters, preachers, and strangers who could appear in one town and disappear into another. For a place like Villisca, that connection was both promise and threat. The same routes that carried business, news, religion, and opportunity could also carry someone no one really knew. Someone who did not belong to the town. Someone who could pass through it, learn its rhythms, and leave before the town had a name for him. But on June 9th, none of that was visible. There was no public warning, no obvious sign that the Moore house had become the center of something waiting to happen. The family came home. The guests settled in. The town went dark. And somewhere between the last ordinary sound of that night and the first uneasy silence of the next morning, Villisca stopped being a small Iowa town with respected family at its center. It became a place where the idea of safety itself was found murdered in bed. The break did not announce itself with a scream that anyone could later remember. That is one of the first disturbing facts of the Villisca case. A house with 8 people inside was attacked in the night, yet the town did not wake to a clear alarm. No neighbor came running because they heard the murders unfold. No witness stepped forward with a complete image of the killer leaving the house. The next morning, the first sign of catastrophe was not noise. It was routine failing to appear. Mary Peckham, the Moore's neighbor, noticed that the family had not come out for their morning chores. In a town like Villisca, that mattered. Ordinary life had a schedule, and the Moore house had missed its place in it. Peckham went to the door. No one answered. The house was locked. She eventually contacted Josiah Moore's brother, Ross, who had a key. When Ross Moore entered the home, the mystery moved from unease into horror. Inside the guest room, he found the Stillinger sisters. The discovery did not unfold like a clean investigative scene. It unfolded like a private nightmare suddenly forced into daylight. The town marshal was called. The rest of the house was searched. Then the full scale of the crime became clear. Josiah and Sarah Moore were dead. Their 4 children were dead. Lena and Ina Stillinger were dead. 8 victims in one house. 6 of them children, all killed while the town slept around them. The weapon was believed to be an axe from the Moore property itself, later found at the scene. That detail gives the crime a special kind of coldness. The killer may not have needed to arrive with a dramatic instrument of violence. The house already contained what he used. But the murders themselves were not the only thing that made the scene feel wrong. There were details that seemed excessive, almost staged. Victims had been covered. Mirrors and reflective surfaces were reported to have been covered. A lamp had been altered so that only a dim light remained. These details are the reason Villisca refuses to behave like a simple home invasion. A killer who only wanted to escape would not need to create silence after the fact. He would not need to soften the light. He would not need to cover what could no longer see him. And yet, inside that house, someone appears to have done more than attack and flee. Someone stayed long enough to leave behind a scene that seemed to speak in fragments. Not a confession, not a signature anyone could safely read, but a pattern of behavior strange enough to keep investigators, writers, locals, and ghost hunters circling the same rooms for generations. Then another break happened, not inside the house, but around it. The crime scene did not remain sealed in the way a modern audience might expect. People came. Curiosity spread. The house became a place the town looked into before the truth had been protected from contamination. That may be one of the most important facts in the entire case. Villisca was not only a murder scene. It became a damaged archive almost immediately. Every footprint, every touch, every rumor, every retelling made it harder to know which details belonged to the killer and which belonged to the town's panic afterward. By the time the case began to form in public memory, the cleanest version of the truth may already have been lost. And that is where the Villisca Axe murders became something larger than a crime. A family had been erased. A town had been violated. And the house, instead of giving up its answer, became a container for everything no one could prove. The official outline of the Villisca case can be told in a few sentences. A family came home from church. They went to sleep. Someone entered the house. 8 people were killed. No one was ever conclusively convicted. But the case does not endure because that outline is simple. It endures because almost every part of it leaves something unresolved. The first thing that does not fit is the silence. 8 people were inside the house. The attack was violent. The victims were not hidden miles away in an isolated field. They were inside a home in a living town, surrounded by neighbors close enough to notice the next morning when something was wrong. And yet the murders pass into history without a clean witness to the moment itself. No one heard enough to stop it. No one saw enough to name the killer. That silence is part of the horror. It makes the house feel sealed from the rest of Villisca, as if the crime happened inside a pocket of darkness the town could not penetrate. The second thing that does not fit is the behavior after the killings. Violence can be impulsive. A killer can panic. A stranger can flee. A personal enemy can act in rage. But Villisca contains signs of something colder than a sudden loss of control. The covered bodies. The reported covered mirrors. The dimmed lamp. The use of an axe found on the property. Each detail can be explained separately. A killer may cover victims out of shame. He may cover mirrors out of superstition, fear, ritual behavior, or simple psychological disturbance. He may adjust a lamp because he needs light, but does not want to be seen. But when those details are placed together, they create a more troubling impression. The killer did not simply pass through the house, like a burglar interrupted in the dark. He appears to have occupied it. For a short time, after the family was no longer alive, the house belonged to him. The third thing that does not fit is motive. If the crime was personal, why kill the children? If the target was Josiah Moore, why extend the violence to every sleeping person under the roof? If the crime was robbery, why does the case not behave like a robbery? If the killer was a stranger, why did he choose this house, this night, this family, and remain calm enough to move through it? Every theory can answer one part of that question. None answers all of it cleanly. The fourth thing that does not fit is the investigation itself. The Villisca house became known before it was fully understood. People entered. Stories spread. Newspapers fed public fascination. Local suspicion moved quickly. Because in a town wounded by a crime like this, people do not only want justice, they want a shape for their fear. Once that happens, the facts begin to compete with rumor. A detail heard secondhand becomes almost as powerful as a detail recorded properly. A strange man becomes a suspect because he feels like one. A local feud becomes darker because the town needs a motive. A confession becomes meaningful even when the law cannot fully trust it. This is how an unsolved crime begins to turn into folklore. Not because the facts disappear, but because they're surrounded by too many stories trying to finish them. And the fifth thing that does not fit is the haunting. The Villisca house is often described today through the language of ghosts. Footsteps, children's voices, cold rooms, unseen presences. Overnight visitors hoping the house will reveal something the case file did not. But the most disturbing possibility is not that the house contains the dead. It is that it contains a failure to explain them. A solved crime can become history. A myth can become entertainment. But Villisca sits in the narrow space between them. Too factual to dismiss as legend. Too unresolved to rest as history. And that may be why the house still feels occupied. Not necessarily by a spirit, but by an unanswered question that has been standing in the same room since 1912. The Villisca case survives because every explanation comes with shadow. There are suspects. There are theories. There are patterns people have tried to connect across towns, motives, confessions, and rumors. But none of them has ever been strong enough to turn the house from a mystery into a closed file. The first explanation is the local motive theory. In this version, the killer was not a faceless stranger passing through Iowa. He was someone connected to the world of the Moore family. Maybe not someone who slept under that roof. Maybe not someone who appeared in the house every week. But someone close enough to know Josiah Moore's routines, his family life, his standing in town, and perhaps the resentment surrounding him. This theory has always had emotional force because it gives the crime a human reason. Small towns can look peaceful from the outside, but they are not free of rivalry, debt, jealousy, pride, humiliation, or private anger. In a place where everyone knows everyone, a business dispute is not just economic. It can become social. A grudge is not just personal. It can become public. Josiah Moore had business connections, local status, and relationships that later became part of speculation around the case. That does not prove a local conspiracy. It does not prove that a rival arranged the murders, but it explains why people kept looking inward. A crime this intimate, inside a family home, naturally makes a town ask whether the danger came from someone it already knew. The problem is scale. If the target was Josiah Moore, why destroy the entire household? If the motive was business, jealousy, revenge, or reputation, why murder children who could not have been the source of the conflict? The local motive theory gives the case a possible reason, but it struggles with the extremity of the act. The second explanation centers on Reverend George Kelly. Kelly is one of the most infamous names attached to Villisca because he sits at the exact point where suspicion becomes uncomfortable. He was a traveling minister. He had been in Villisca around the time of the murders. He later became entangled in the investigation, confessed, recanted, and was tried. But the courts did not deliver the final certainty the public wanted. He was not convicted. That matters. It is easy more than a century later to turn Kelly into a character instead of a legal reality. A strange preacher, a disturbing presence, a man close enough to the story to seem impossible to ignore. But suspicion is not the same as proof. The case against him carried dramatic power, and dramatic power can be dangerous. It gives people someone to imagine in the house, someone with a face, someone who can absorb the fear that would otherwise remain shapeless. But the legal outcome left the question open. If Kelly was the answer was never made strong enough to hold. And if he was not the answer, then his role in the public imagination shows something else. How badly Villisca needed a person to become the shape of its nightmare. The third explanation is the traveling killer theory. This version pushes a case beyond Villisca. It asks whether the Moore house was not the center of a local vendetta, but one stop in a broader pattern of early 20th century axe murders. That idea is powerful because it fits the America of the time. Rail lines connected small towns. Strangers moved through communities with less documentation than modern life demands. A man could arrive, watch, wait, and leave before suspicion had a permanent name. There were other violent axe attacks in that era, and researchers have long debated whether some of them may have been connected. The pattern is tempting. Sleeping families, night attacks, blunt, overwhelming violence, a killer who vanishes. For a mystery audience, this theory has a dark elegance. It makes Villisca part of something larger. Not one cursed house, but a map. Not one murderer's rage, but a moving shadow crossing the American Midwest and beyond. But this theory has its own weakness. Patterns can be real. They can also be created by fear. When people look backward through unsolved violence, they can make separate crimes seem connected because the mind hates randomness. Similarity is not identity. An axe murder in one town does not automatically explain an axe murder in another. A shared method does not prove a shared killer. The traveling killer theory gives Villisca scale, but scale is not the same as certainty. The fourth explanation is psychological rather than geographical. Maybe the key is not in a clean motive at all. Maybe the killer was not acting from a rational objective that investigators could reconstruct. This will help explain the strange behavior inside the house, the covered victims, the dimmed light, the possible covering of mirrors, the lack of a straightforward robbery logic, the sense that the killer did not merely commit violence, but entered a state where the house became part of his ritual, panic, shame, or obsession. This explanation is unsettling because it removes the comfort of motive. People prefer crimes that can be explained by money, revenge, jealousy, or fear. Those motives are ugly, but they are understandable. Villisca is harder because the scene suggests a mind that may not have been following a normal script. But this theory also has limits. When we say a crime was psychological, we risk using mystery as a substitute for evidence. We can explain anything by saying the killer was disturbed. That may be true. It may also become a way to stop asking harder questions. And that is the problem with Villisca. Every theory opens a door. Then, just behind it, there is another locked room. A local enemy explains familiarity, but not the scale. Reverend Kelly gives a public a suspect, but not a conviction. A traveling killer explains disappearance, but not certainty. A psychological break explains a strangeness, but not identity. This is why the case became more than a crime file. It became a machine for producing explanations. Each generation returns to the same facts, rearranges them, and hopes the pattern will finally hold. But the house resists. It does not give one answer. It gives fragments. And fragments are exactly what keep a mystery alive. The Villisca Axe murders reveal more than the terror of one night. They reveal what happens when a community loses a story it needs in order to feel safe. Before the murders, Villisca could believe in the ordinary protections of small-town life. Neighbors, church, family reputation, familiar streets. The assumption that danger, if it existed, would announce itself from outside. But the Moore house shattered that belief. The killer did not only take lives. He entered the most intimate space a family had, used what was already inside it, and left behind a scene that the town can neither fully explain nor fully forget. That is why the haunting matters. Not because every ghost story attached to the house must be accepted as fact, but because haunting is what people often call a past that refuses to become past. When a crime is solved, society can assign it a shape. There is a motive, a trial, a name, a sentence, a final paragraph. Villisca never received that structure. Instead, it received suspects without closure, evidence without completion, and memory without rest. The house became a place where grief, fear, curiosity, and entertainment slowly fused together. People came looking for the dead, but often what they were really confronting was the absence of an answer. That may be the most unsettling thing about Villisca. The case does not survive only because it is brutal. Many crimes are brutal. It survives because it exposes how fragile certainty can be. A small town believed it knew itself. An investigation believed it could reconstruct the night. The public believed that enough attention would eventually produce a truth. But attention is not the same as understanding. Sometimes the more people stare at a mystery, the less stable it becomes. Facts become symbols. Suspects become characters. A house becomes a shrine. And the original horror is buried beneath a second horror. The realization that some truths can be damaged beyond recovery. That is what Villisca really reveals. Not simply that evil can enter a home, but that once the truth is lost, a place can remain occupied by the shape of what no one could prove. More than a century later, the Villisca house still stands. Its rooms are no longer just rooms. They are evidence, memory, attraction, legend, and warning. People still cross the threshold trying to feel something. Some hope for a sound in the dark. Some hope for a photograph that cannot be explained. Some hope the house will answer a question the courts never could. But maybe Villisca's power comes from something colder than ghosts. Maybe the house feels alive because the case never truly died. 8 people went to sleep there in 1912, and the truth never woke up with the town. That is why Villisca remains one of America's most haunted crime scenes. Not only because of what people claim to hear inside it, but because of what no one was ever able to prove. Some houses are haunted by the dead. Villisca is haunted by the missing ending. And if you want more case files where history, fear, and the unknown refuse to stay buried, subscribe to Black File Society.